Hi everyone, here's the Chemist once again, and today for something completely different I'm going to review Jason and the Argonauts by Apollonius of Rhodes, specifically the Penguin Classics edition translated by Poochigian and with an introduction and notes by Benjamin Acosta Hughes. And full disclaimer, me and Poochigian are good friends, and he gave me my copy of the book. I'm so grateful, Aaron. You probably can't see it, but it's slightly ruined by water because the night he gave it to me, it was in Venice, it was raining like hell, and we enjoyed a very nice walk through the Acqua Alta, which is when the canals overflow, and my new sneakers were ruined. It was lots of fun and I hated it, but it was so great finally meeting him. But at the same time, don't think that I'm going to be so enthusiastic when it comes to this book just because I like the guy who translated it. In fact, I'm really not necessarily the right audience for this book. I know very little about classical literature, about ancient Greece. So many things in this book, as with the very few other Greek classics I've read, still puzzle me. Like, was there really such an abundance of sheep and cattle all over the place back in Greece that they slaughtered them for sacrifices every half hour? If you need to go to Georgia back to Greece, how can you end up in Lombardy? And Zeus is not an answer to that question. And let's backtrack a second. What about those husbands of women with child who pretend they are themselves with child? Is that a thing that actually happened? And they didn't really bury their people by hanging them to trees, did they? What I'm saying is that my review of the book is going to mirror my experience of it, which is that of a fan of adventure stories who doesn't necessarily know much about Greek literature, classical literature, and about ancient Greece in general. And if by any means you are in my same position, if you like a good adventure yarn, I cannot possibly recommend the Argonauts enough. And if there is any classical scholar watching this video, I know that everything I'm going to talk about has so many implications and has been studied so widely by so many different perspectives. If anyone out there is interested in deepening their understanding of the poem and its historical context and its literary context, the different critical perspectives on it, this edition, the Penguin Classics edition, and its bibliographical apparatus and its bibliography and Benjamin Acosta Hughes introduction, all of these are very good tools to start delving deeper into the history of the Argonautica. Otherwise, you can just read the poem and you're going to have such great fun with it. In his note to the translation, Poochigian said that his intention was to create the most engaging and readable translation of the poem available. And this, Jason and the Argonauts, is immensely engaging. The premise is very simple. An old asshole of a Greek king, because of some prophecy, decides to send Jason, the supposed protagonist of the poem, more on that in a second, on a quest to retrieve a golden fleece at the other end, on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. And so Jason assembles a crew of heroes and he starts on this quest on his awesome ship, the Argo. As with other works of classical literature, the Iliad most notably that I know of, the poem begins with a very long section where you basically get the name of all the heroes involved in the story, of their fathers or parents, and of the town they came from. My guess there too, as someone who knows very little about context, is that in ancient Greece there were like 200 people in the entire peninsula, so that it made sense for the poem to go, this guy Teclonis, he was the son of Giovanni the Baker. Ah, Giovanni the Baker, I know him. So now I know who you're talking about. And make no mistake, I read the Iliad several years ago, I had great fun with it, much more than with the Odyssey for whatever reason. Maybe it was the translation, but even though the Odyssey is full of adventures and monsters, I found the Iliad much more engaging and relatable, if that makes sense. Anyway, the Iliad, the long list of heroes, the catalogue, well, it was boring. It was a list of Greek names. Here, far from it. All of these heroes, well, most of these heroes are memorable. All of them have some special abilities that make them stand out from the rest. There are people in here who can fly. There's Orpheus in here, who is kind of a level 20 bard. His music can move boulders and he can calm down people when they're angry. He is just a sick liar shredder. There's Tiphys in here, who's an excellent sailor, the best in the world. There's Mopsus here, who can interpret the flight of birds and read the future. There's Hidmon, who is convinced that he will die in Asia, far away from home, and everyone's like, come on Hidmon, don't be like that, I'm sure you'll be fine. And what makes this character so interesting and so amazingly vivid and lifelike, larger than life in a way, but relatable too, is that in spite of the fact that the quest involves retrieving some magical object from a faraway land, and they have to travel across the known world in order to do that, and they fight monsters, and there's magic involved, and the gods come down from Olympus to intervene in their affairs, in spite of all this, well, actually they're much more three-dimensional than you would expect. There is a guy in here called Idas, who is cocksure. He is very good with spears, and he's like, oh, I'm going to slaughter all the enemies on our path. And he plays a role in here, but yeah, he is very much the crew's douchebag. But in being so, he is kind of an exception, and other people are like, well, Idas, come on, don't be so sure about that, and try and be a bit more moderate in your arrogance. These are not at all perfect, godlike heroes whose triumphs are glorious and whose fall is tremendous and tragic. These are actual human beings with flaws and fears, and several times in the course of the poem they are prey to despair, and they believe they are not going to complete their quest, and they get depressed because of that. Heracles is probably the other big exception, the hero from an older, let's say, a more ancient conception of the hero as perfect and incredibly strong, and it's significant that the rest of the crew basically at the beginning, they want to make him the leader of the expedition, but he is not. And while I'm not going to spoil you the poem, let's just say that Heracles doesn't play too much of a role in the poem in the Argonautica, and yet he does. He is always on the sideline. It's almost as if there's a constant tension in the poem between what an hero like Heracles is supposed to be, which is perfect and godlike, and what Jason and the Argonauts are, which is flawed, and even when they have gods as relatives, only human. And these people mess up lots of times in the course of the poem, and by the end of it, in order to be able to come home again, they will have to compromise and to do some horrible stuff, some truly Game of Thrones level sort of shit. And part of this, let's call it relatability factor, is definitely due to Aaron's brilliant translation, to the fact that he uses modern language, and especially he plays with registers a lot in the course of the play, but lots of it is clearly in the original. What he did, again, in that translation note, is again to find a voice that could accommodate the poem's range of modes, tones and character voices, but the voice he found, he is confident, is Apollonius's own. In one of my favorite passages, Jason and the Argonauts have finally reached the city in Georgia on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, in modern-day Georgia, of course, where the Golden Fleece is, and the local king doesn't really want them to take that thing away, because apparently it looked real nice, and it was very important back in the ancient world, and so he comes up with a challenge for Jason, and he goes, if you can complete this obviously impossible and terrible challenge, then the Golden Fleece is all yours. And when Jason reports this news to the rest of the crew, he goes, well, since I could not come up with something better, I vow to take the challenge on myself. And I love this, because this very important moment when he's going, I am going to complete the challenge even though I know it will be my doom, the way it's written, what I imagine it is something like, guys, I couldn't come up with an alternative, so I'll have to do what the king says. And I can visualize the rest of the crew very clearly going like, Jason, come on, you screwed up. What are we supposed to do now? I guess I'll have to do it, and we'll see how it goes. And thank God, thank the gods, Medea is there, and Medea, possibly the protagonist, well, either Jason, Heracles in absentia, or Medea are the potential protagonists of the play, and Medea is definitely the most interesting character, the sorceress who helps Jason and the Argonauts do the things they do to win. And the way she's characterized, her psychological characterization in particular, the description of how she's torn between her commitment to her family and her love of Jason is beauty. It's impossibly beautiful. So many pages in the poem are dedicated to her doubts, to the complexities of her situation, to the very miserable place where life has brought her. And the way she handles all that and the way that is narrated is just beautiful, and it seems just too good and too insightful for a poem from the classical world, from millennia ago. That is not to mention the fact that she has some truly awesome powers, and she takes care of a giant snake and of a bronze giant called Talos, as you can see on the cover, while Jason does exactly what he is portrayed doing on the cover, which is looking around without looking too intelligent. And also, make no mistake, for all that the poem feels very modern and it's always plot driven, and the adventure is always going on and flowing forward very fast, and Aaron's use of language augments this idea very well and makes for a very exciting read. There are some truly startling moments of lyrical beauty in here, and some reflections that you'll just have to underline and to pause a second and think about. Possibly my favorite comes in book 4. I'm not going to spoil you what happens, but basically Jason and Medea, they are in love and they want to do a thing a certain way, but they can't, and they have to settle for something else. And it's a happy moment for them, make no mistake, but they really would have so much rather done the thing differently. And the truth is, we, the members of the who-struck tribes of mortals, never tread the pathways to the light with confidence. Some bitter anguish always shambles along beside our happiness. And this old Egyptian dude from 2300 years ago? Apollonius, I get you, you're right. That's true. In recent years I've been reading mostly contemporary American fiction, and hey, make no mistake, there's lots of intercultural connections to be found there, lots of things about American society. As an Italian living in the UK, someone from Europe, lots of things about America look like they're out of Middle Earth and foreign, but when you read stuff coming from such a remote place in time, and you feel those kinds of human connection, you really feel very strongly the immense power literature has to create and establish these forms of connection between different people and to highlight what makes us humans. And if you can get that, and giant snakes, and bronze giants, and magic, and flying people, and powerful bards, and fights, and intrigue, and treachery, and all sorts of stuff. Speaking of Middle Earth, Benjamin Acosta Hughes says something very interesting in the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition. He goes, while the Argonautica is on the one hand an epic hexameter poem heavily imbued throughout by Homeric and Hesiodic tradition, it is in other ways quite new, and to a modern reader, particularly one coming to the poem without much experience of its earlier models, may read much more like Tolkien in poetic form than anything else. And this will perhaps be right. In its combination of the real and the fantastical, its engagement with traditions of medicine, astronomy and science, its magical vessel that speaks and yet serves as the plating of water nymphs, heroes that have wings, and a king whose grandfather is the center of the solar system, it is truly without exact parallel in previous or contemporary Greek literature. It's true, if you are a fan of fantastic, imaginative storytelling in whatever form, if you are a fan of adventures, if you are a fan of good storytelling, by no means should you miss out on Jason and the Argonauts. It's impossibly beautiful, and Aaron Poochigian's translation is so engaging, so entertaining, it flows very fast. It's just such fun to read. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. If you've read the Argonauts, let me know what you think of it. If any classical scholar is watching this video, please contribute your own experience, your own take on the poem, on your reading of it, on your critical interpretation, and in general let me know about your experience with classical works, with works from such a faraway world. Besides being an awesome translator, he also translated for Penguin Classics the poems of Sappho, which I'm currently reading and enjoying very much. He is also an incredible poet in his own right. In particular, he wrote a lyrical novel, a novel in verse called Mr. Either Or, which is impossibly great. There's going to be a link to my review of it on the screen in a few seconds. And thank you as always for watching, guys. Bye, guys.